Welcome everyone to this evening's program. I am just absolutely thrilled. We have, for those of you on Zoom who don't know this, we have an absolutely packed room. We are jammed right to the gills. Super excited to be able to welcome this great group to learn about some really cool Apple stuff from our guest tonight. My name is Julia Gray. I'm the executive director here at the Wilson Museum in Castine, Maine, the homeland of the Penobscot Nation and their Wabanaki relations. Our mission is to cultivate and encourage human connection across place, time, and cultures. A special thank you to Bangor Savings Bank, whose sponsorship makes this program series possible over the course of our year. I do want to share some upcoming programs we have, if you're not already aware. On Bastille Day, July 14th, which you're getting prepped for today, we have a French vanilla ice cream social from 2 to 4 p.m. We serve a lot of French vanilla ice cream with patriotically blue and red strawberries and blueberries on it. Patriotically, whichever flag you want. The Castine Town Band will be doing their annual performance here at the museum on Friday, July 18th from 6 to 7. And tickets are now available for our Journey from Curiosity to Preservation wine pairing event on July 22nd, which is an opportunity to learn more about Wilson Museum collections paired with fascinating wines with fascinating stories based on geography. So this will be the third year we're doing this event, and those tickets are available through our calendar on our website. And of course, coming up in August, on Saturday, August 16th, is our second annual Artisan Market and Community Picnic. We're hoping for a great turnout for that. We'd love to have you all back for that. You can visit the calendar section on our website for more information and details. I also certainly encourage, if you're not already, to sign up for our e-newsletter, because then you'll get all the most recent information about what's coming up. This evening, we are so pleased to welcome Todd Little-Siebold to share with us what he has been learning about Acadian apples through a combination of historical research and DNA testing. I'm not going to talk more about that because you're going to hear about that from him. Todd is a history professor at College of the Atlantic, where he also leads the COA Maine Apple Lab. I first worked with Todd when I was doing research on some really old apple trees in the Lubec area for a project with Cobscope Shores, which is a private land conservation organization. They were creating some panels, and there's some really fascinating apple history in the Lubec, Cobscope Bay area. Todd has a BA in anthropology and did his master's and PhD research on the history of Guatemala in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His story, he's one of these historians who he seems like every kind of history. He also teaches about, while at COA, he teaches about Latin American history, but he also teaches agricultural and fisheries history. And in that context, better understandings of the varied forms of power in diverse historical and geographical settings. Todd and his students have also been doing some really fascinating archival research around early Wabanaki European interactions, including a project to uncover, or I would probably say recover, the story and the history of the so-called Walker Pond Massacre, which is something that's been really fascinating for me in this Bagaduce area. I'm going to turn it over to Todd, and we'll go from here. Thank you.
Explain a little bit more about these grandmothers. I use that sort of a colorful term for these French apples that are in the background of almost all early American apples.
Todd, I'm going to ask you to switch out your mic.
My mic?
Yeah.
It's not working? Okay, fair enough. Okay, let's see.
That's a green light, Betty, so I think it's good now.
Okay, is that good? Yeah. It'll hang off with me. Okay. Okay, so it's a delight to be here. I often say it's like a AA meeting. I'm Todd, and I'm obsessed with apples, particularly historic apples, and particularly historic apples in Hancock County, Hancock and Washington counties. I focus most of my effort and time and energy looking basically along the western shore of the Penobscot to the Canadian border, because I decided that trying to look at everything might drive me crazy. It's not always so. As Julia said, I was trained as a Latin American historian. My work my traditional scholarship is on the sort of colonial era and the formation of the Guatemalan state and its relationship with Native Americans. I have a deep interest in in traditional agriculture in indigenous communities in the Maya world, and so that translated relatively well to the work that I ended up doing in this area as well. And I basically made it my life's work recently to contribute to the work of tracking down, researching, and preserving Maine's and turns out most of America's early heirloom fruit. My day job is a history professor at College of the Atlantic. I was just saying to Haley that one of the things that's great about this is they say, essentially the deal is this: welcome, you're the history department. Teach whatever you want. And that poses quite the dilemma, right? Because the typical academic structure is a kind of Noah's Ark, right? They say, well, we need an early modern Europeanist, we need a modern Europeanist, we need a revolutionary period early Republic Americanist, we might need a Latin Americanist too, right? And so one of the things that this has done for me is really forced me to think about how is it that I teach history to a generation of students who've had sort of the same kind of generic history high school that I had, which is I knew a little bit, I could pass a test, but nobody had really gotten me interested. They hadn't really posed the problem, or put it differently, had never really asked what I was interested in finding out about the past. So this really is sort of in the background how I ended up stumbling across working on apples. Because the local apples are the last vestiges of a thriving agricultural economy that basically has disappeared, certainly in Hancock County, and began disappearing in 1860. So that when we're looking around the landscape, what we see, the old apple trees, the old lilacs, the old daylilies that tell us, okay, here's where people lived a different sort of life. And it sort of struck me that this was going to be a great way to sort of teach local history, get people into archives, into historical societies doing research. And I was like, this is great. Little did I know, however, that it was going to become my obsession. I was like, oh, well, this would be a great class to teach. And now I spend most of my waking hours on this research. So my work is basically to discover, to find old trees, to document them, and to help preserve them. This tree is a tree in Tremont. It is 11.5 feet in circumference. Okay, so those students can almost touch on the backside. It is one that our friend Rudy Kelly, who found it, calls colorfully Jake 1829, because the house has a little sign on it that says 1829, and his friend Jake owned the house. So what I've learned in the 15 years of doing this work, and a lot of it is inspired by my friend John Bunker, who's here with us tonight, who's spent 50 years doing this. So he's chuckling like 15 years. Well, welcome to the club, buddy. You still got 35 years. Let's go. He often talks about beginner's mind, that you have to understand that your experience is both great. It helps you to know what you're seeing, but it's also a danger because sometimes you think you know what you're seeing. So you have to cultivate this sense constantly that what you're seeing is new to you. And that you have to sort of ask, you have to be curious and ask the question, what am I seeing? What's going on here? What happened here? This is a great example of this. Yesterday I was out on Bartlett's Island. We're mapping all of the old farms and all the old orchards out there. And we walk out to this place where there's a tree right on the edge of the water and this beautiful flat place. No evidence historically of a farm there that we know of, but here's this tree and here's this gorgeous flat spot. So we walk down on the shore. It turns out it's a Native American midden. And settlers often used places where middens, where settlements had been, because they were often open and you could just come in and plant on them. So I was like, oh. And so the experience of knowing what a midden looks like, but also saying like, there's no farm here. I can't look here because there's no farm here, which I had done before. I had not gone down this trail because I was like, oh, there's no farm down there. So I found a new tree. The capacity also to unlearn what you think you know. When you're looking at a map, when you're looking at census records, you have to sort of say, okay, I think this, but that may not be what happened. That may not be what's true. And you have to have kind of a time traveler's mind. You have to say, what did this look like 300 years ago, 400 years ago? And to sort of play with this sort of fast forwards, slow motion to try to understand what might have happened here. Going deep into history, beyond what the local historical societies may or may not have written down or might be in the collections of a local museum or whatever, you have to think what happened here before there were any documents. What, who, when. And that question, the art of reframing questions so that you can sort of follow the evidence doggedly has been really, it's a delight, and it's totally addictive. It's so fun because when you stumble across something that sort of says, oh, yes, here we go. So one of the things that really launched me in my current scurrying around obsession is the discovery by geneticists and apple breeders that almost all early American apples have French ancestors, either a parent or a grandparent that is French, which just totally surprised me. It was not what I was expecting. And again, in the sort of unlearning phase, it's like, okay, so how is this true? In Maine, this inspired our work because we began collecting DNA samples of apples to try to begin to rebuild the family tree of apples in this area to understand what we were finding. And Muranti and et al. in 2020 basically began to show us the pedigree of almost all apples in the world and the most significant ancestors. And in America, the most significant ancestors are French, so far. So there may be English ancestors that haven't been tested that aren't yet part of this project, but so far the signal is definitively French. And we find again and again that they're in the background of a huge number of apples from early 17th century apples onwards. And this is incredibly interesting and requires okay, so how, what? And the grandmothers that I refer to them as grandmothers sort of colorfully are these 5 apples: Renette Franche, Jappe d'Or de Bretagne, Renette de Hollande, Renette de Carme, and Calvi Rouge. And they are in the background of almost every early American apple. Many of them are parents of, 2 of these are parents of famous American apples. And what I love about this is until our friend Cameron Peace at the Washington State University in Pullman introduced us to this, it would never have occurred to me that these would be the most significant ancestors, known ancestors today, of American apples. And so you're like, oh, okay, now I've got to unthink some things and see where this takes us. So our friend Nick Howard, who is in the Netherlands, worked at the University of Minnesota and did work on this. He was reconstructing the apples, the ones that are in sort of maroon up here, are apples that were used in the University of Minnesota breeding program. So how many folks have had a Honeycrisp apple here? Okay, so really interesting thing is Honeycrisp was selected and then rejected at Minnesota. They thought it wouldn't sell. And then somebody said, hey, I think maybe people would like this apple. It sort of it got lost for a little while and then was rediscovered and reintroduced and became the most phenomenal commercial success of any introduced American bred apple in a long time. But interestingly, they did not know the parents. And so using the genetic techniques, they began to reconstruct Honeycrisp and figure out where this ultra crispness came from. So they were interested particularly in breeding, but they also were rebuilding the family tree of American apples. And you can see up at the top, our friend Renette Franche. So you can imagine there would be one for each of the ancestors, a little family tree that would show you these relationships. And you'll see at the top of the list, Aesopus Spitzenberg, Thomas Jefferson's famous apple, Famuse, what we call in Maine the snow apple, probably a 17th century French apple from Canada, yellow bellflower, an early apple from New Jersey. So as you go down, Macintosh, your favorite fall apple. So once you start thinking of a family tree, you say, oh, this is a really interesting historical problem, because the ancestors are eternal. Okay, because you can graft the tree and graft the tree and graft the tree, so that, you know, Macintosh, the original Macintosh tree was found in 1798, 1799, and every apple tree in the world that is a Macintosh comes from that one tree originally. So the Macintosh of today is Macintosh, is that Macintosh. It's a clone. I'll explain this. We'll get to a biology lesson in a minute. But so it's a family tree, just like 23andMe or Ancestry or, you know, do your genealogy, except your parents and grandparents can live forever. Excuse me. So very, very interesting as a historical problem. So what's interesting in the Muranti et al. Is they did an amazing job of showing the network of relationships among all of the apples and identifying significant apples that have contributed globally to our eating apples of today. And you can see, I'm going to walk over here, these little, there's a green dot, an orange dot, a purple dot, and a red dot. These are the founders of lineages. And they're basically like super founders. You may have read about sort of in human genomics, Genghis Khan and his people have a lot of children and, you know, people who come after them. So the red is Reinette Franche, and I'm going to focus in on this because it just gives you an example of an important apple. So Reinette Franche is at the center of this network of apples that are related to one another. And in American apples, she is in the lineage of Baldwin, one of the most famous apples in North America. In 1920, 1 in 3 apple trees in Maine was a Baldwin. Rhode Island greening, 17th century apple from Rhode Island, famous, grown for hundreds of years in the United States, all over the country. Roxbury russet, famous New England apple, probably from 1640 maybe in Massachusetts. Canada Reinette that comes down from Canada, Aesopus Spitzenberg, the list goes on. And you can imagine, right, my lectures are an hour and a half, so you all are getting the condensed version. I would give you the entire list if it was in my class. So one of the other grandmothers is one called Drap d'Or de Bretagne, the cloth of gold of Brittany. And in Maine, curiously, many of our apples are children and grandchildren, particularly of this apple. And our hyperlocal apples are children of this beautiful, and it has now been publicly identified as Drap d'Or. We used to have to call it unknown founder 13, but now we know it's been identified. So in our area, there are apples from Cape Jellison, east and west, that are grandchildren of Reinette Franche. Wyndham russet, there's one up at Lubec that's a grandchild of Reinette Franche. Then golden russet number 2, we're trying to figure out what this is a child of unknown founder of Drap d'Or, 20-ounce Bourassa. So you can see this, and again, I'm sparing you the details. The list is really long, but these are sort of highlights. And again, this tree is up, was up at Red Point in Lubec, and it fell over in a storm a year ago. So I refer to this section of my talk as the questions I did not have. You know, how, when, and where did these French apples become the ancestors of American apples? I was sort of, I just assumed they must be English apples that are brought, and because Massachusetts is really good at telling its story, it must have been Massachusetts. Plymouth Rock is really important, right? So it must have been there, blah, blah, blah. So what's interesting is how, when, and where this happened is something that genetic research can tell us happened, but it can't tell us particularly where, how, and why. And so it requires, us to take up the history buried in the genetics and try to bring to bear historical research and, you know, some logic of where it is in the family tree, where is it popping up. You'll see sometimes that there'll be a limit, like it doesn't show up. Some apples don't show up as ancestors until a certain date. So you can do a little bit of historical work. So this question of time and space, and I'm quite lucky in being in Hancock County because Castine is a very early site of French settlement, and it is a place where, you know, there's relatively good documentation. So all of this basically spawns two big questions. One that I'm going to focus on today, why and how American apples have such prominent French ancestry. And there's another question is, where are the the English ancestors? Like, why aren't we finding English ancestors? So John Bunker and my friend Dave Fulton from Blue Hill, we went to England to meet with folks to sort of say, well, what are you testing? You know, why are we missing the English ancestors? Because the assumption is that there are some that just haven't been tested. They haven't, you know, yet. That's another talk. Maybe I'll come back, you know, next. Do you all ever celebrate the English year? Maybe we could do the. Okay, so we're in Castine. It's very obvious to you all. You all know the French history, right? And it's sort of like, oh yes, and we know how this must have happened. But first, I'm going to start with a biology lesson. Okay, so I said that these apples can be eternal ancestors, and that's because of grafting. So grafting is where I take a piece off of a tree. I don't know if you all have any apple trees. So I would just go take a piece off, and I would put it on what's called a rootstock, and I would create another apple tree of that exact same cultivar. So interestingly, genetically, the bottom is one apple, and the top is another. Okay, and this is super important. Most people don't know this, so this is a little bit of my shtick. I almost always do this because it blows people's minds usually. So this is a Macintosh, one of the children of Renette Franche, and here are these seeds, and I'm gonna do something that I often do. So I'm gonna give Haley a seed. Okay. And Haley now has a genetically unique apple in her hand. She plants that. It is not a Macintosh. It's the Haley apple. That seed is genetically unique. Okay? There's not another apple like it in the world, and there will never be another apple like it in the world unless somebody grafts it. Okay? You with me? Right? So I have 10 seeds in here, 5 seeds in here, and there are 5 genetically unique apples in these seeds that have never existed and will never exist again. It'll be like Macintosh, maybe, depending on who the parents are, but may not be. And this is the other part. So that's, so now you're grasping this. Okay, so that Macintosh tree this came off of has 5 to 10 seeds in every piece of fruit, and every seed in every apple every year is genetically unique. Okay, so these are diversity machines. They're crazy, crazy diverse. And what's interesting about this then is all of the apples that we have are either from seed. Somebody found an apple that was growing along a fence line or wherever and said, oh, I'm going to call this the Haley apple, right? She plants it, you know, blah, blah. Or it had to be grafted. So those are the only 2 options. So when we find a cultivar, when we find an apple that is a named apple, we know that somebody grafted that tree. Okay? So this, if you begin to think about this, this is absolutely nutty, because it means that all of the American apples that are children of a Renette Franche, right, very likely 50% chance, because the mother and father came out of a Renette Franche apple and somebody planted that seed, and off we go. We have a new variety. So when we have a Renette Franche, somebody carried that stick of wood across the ocean and stuck it on a rootstock and grew it. Or, you know, if it's a child or a grandchild, they had to get it from a seed. really, really fascinating, because when we go back to this relationship, these sets of relationships, right? You're like, oh, okay. Every one of the apples that emerges is a new apple, genetically unique, and then it's selected and it's grafted so that it can be propagated over generations. Okay, so this is critical to understand, because, and you're starting to guess, so that if I find a French apple, somebody brought that apple and grafted it. Okay, so it must be grafted. Somebody had to take a piece of sign wood and graft it onto a new tree. Okay, but you say, but Todd, that's crazy. Where did apples come from? You're telling me this is crazy. There are no native crab apples, no native apples in Maine, no native apples in Vermont or New Hampshire, maybe Western Vermont, maybe Western Massachusetts, one called Malus coronaria. But Malus domestica comes from Europe, and it is the product of thousands of years of human movement from Central Asia into the Middle East and Western Europe. So our eating apple is what's called an interspecific hybrid. It's a hybrid of 3 species of apples. It is not a species, it's an interspecific hybrid. And so the closest crab apple to us, a native tree that would produce something approximating an apple, is this one here, Malus coronaria. A little thing. It's called the sweet crab apple, but it's not very sweet. I often say they're edible but not palatable. The angustifolia, which is the local crab apple where I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, it is amazing for throwing at your brothers. About that much. So, and here are the 4 main apples that contribute to Malus domestica, what we eat. Malus sylvestris, which is from Kazakhstan, Western China, the Tian Shan Mountains, Uzbekistan. Malus cerevisiae, which is from that region. Malus orientalis, which is from Iran, Turkey. Malus sylvestris from Western Europe, they're the blue ones. And then Malus baccata, which is sort of Siberia. Okay, so the genetics of them come together over maybe 8,000 years. Humans selecting them for bigger and better fruit, and then eventually, I'm proposing around 1500, somebody brings an apple to North America, and we're off to the races. Okay, now back to the French and maybe Dutch ancestors. Okay, so there are 2 lines of investigation or hypotheses that we're pursuing. One is that the French and Dutch introduced continental apples to North America first, and in much greater proportion than we think. So they're showing up in the genetics, so that's one potential hypothesis. And the second is that French ancestry is actually a critical contributor to English apples. The English would hate this idea, but they know it's true. And that it's sort of some missing links are also in England that have not yet been tested.
What?
So, and I won't go into the details. There's some logical
Right
things
now,
where the English apples that are descended from these same super ancestors are very different from the ones that are in America. So there's a divergent development. So what is the evidence for the earliest introductions of apples? So I made this rash claim that somebody introduced an apple somewhere around 10, 15, something. Why is this? Well, because Verrazano is coasting along the southern coast of New England in 1524, and he lands and he says, "Today we saw the Acadie apple." Oops, sorry. Sorry. It doesn't like me. This is the Acadie apple. So this is a very common apple. In England, it's called the lady apple. It's a very small, super sweet apple. So in southern New England, where there are no native crabs, he sees an apple that he identifies as being a European apple in 1524. Okay, so I'm saying, well, sometime before 1524, it could be a seedling, likely a seedling. Maybe somebody threw an apple overboard on a ship. Who knows? But there is evidence, or there's a plausible evidence that there is an apple that is introduced into New England by 1524. The first orchard that's recorded is planted in 1604 in St. Croix Island, in the middle of St. Croix, of the St. Croix River in Maine. Planting of fruit trees at Saint-Sauveur, an MDI, 1613 recorded. First shipment of English apples into New England, 1631. And then the first recorded nursery that we've been able to find records of, 1648. So this is extremely early, and particularly this period between 1524 and 1604. And the Appy apple could have come from England or it could have come from France, but the apples that are brought to St. Croix in 1604 are brought from France. And I actually was going to add to this. So 1670, 1680, in Castine, Baron de Saint-Castine plants an orchard.
What are you walking up and down the stairs?
So Maine and the Maritimes are a familiar place to Europeans. They're traveling over here from about 1505, 1510 to fish. They're fishing all up and down the coast. And there's a boom of fishing on this coast. So that by 1550, this is pretty familiar territory to European fishermen down this way. And there's one report of a fishing station in this area in 1550. So 1524, southern New England, 1550, fishing station in this area. Again, these are just maps, 1529, 1539, to show you that people knew all about this. There were, by the 1640s, 1650s, there are hundreds of ships fishing in New England waters from Europe. People often sort of focus on the settlement. When did people come to Plymouth? When did they come to St. Croix or Port Royal or whatever? But there's about a 60 or 70 year period where people are coming to this coast before they settle permanently. They settle seasonally. And it seems very likely that apples or genetic material is introduced at that point. Okay, so just a little tiny, I know I'm a professor, but I have to give you the sort of primer. So the first sailing along this is Cabot, 1497, fishermen along the coast by 1510. Esteban Gomez goes up to a place that is today called Bangor. In 1524, Verrazano comes along the coast. 34, Cartier, settlement of Charlesbourg in Canada, 1541, St. Croix, 1604, Port Royal, 1605, 1608, Quebec, and 1613, MDI briefly settled and the planting of fruit trees. And this is just a map, and it's one of these things just to say people are going up and down the coast constantly during this period before permanent settlement. This is just an early map of Quebec, and you can see the orchards here in Quebec. The Wabanaki from this area would go to Quebec and Montreal. Took them 2 weeks. They went there every year. So in Upper Canada, so the Upper Midwest, by 1700, there are 10,000 people along the St. Lawrence, 20,000 inhabitants in Eastern Canada, and about 4,000 French settlers along the Mississippi River in the Illinois country. So agriculture, French settlers all along that area, French settlements in Detroit, Kaskazia, Michilimackinac, trading posts, North America, including Castine, Maine. And this is just a picture of a map from Manhattan. I won't go through all this, but you can see the orchards here in Manhattan. This is mid-17th century. So here in Pentegat, in Castine. What's interesting about the history here, and Ron and I have been reading the same book of the history of Castine that just has sort of the Wheeler, timeline of everything that happened. Father Biard is here. He's a Jesuit priest. Is here in 1611. He's the one who plants the seeds on MDI in 1613. Charles D'Aulnay is here, 1630s to 1650s. Capuchin missions are here. English settlers are here. Then Pentegat is returned to the French. And this is when Baron de Saint-Castine shows up, 1670. And their habitants, French settlers, scattered along the coast. And this is one of the things that I think is super important. And I don't have to tell you all this because in Castine, I think this is maybe better known, but there are French settlers all along this coast, dozens of them. Two down at Deer Isle, Little Deer Isle, Sullivan, Lemoyne, Oak Point, all over the place. And one of the things I say about these people is they did not want anyone to know where they were, because the English would kill them and the French would tax them. So they were here, but they are very, very poorly documented. And so this very interesting period that we're interested in finding when these early introductions happened are just terribly documented. And often, as you'll see, through sort of these kinds of hearsay and sort of poorly documented sources. So this is a map of this area from 1671. It's drawn by the governor of New France, Grandfontaine, and it's upside down. South is up. It's looking from Quebec down at the coast of Maine, and we're down here. This is the Penobscot, and we're right down here. So by 1671, you begin to see the settlement, and then, of course, the famous Baron de Saint-Castine shows up. It's very interesting. Actually, there's a picture of Castine in the other room, and he has this very funny little hat on. And I was like, how do they know he had this hat on? This is a historian's question. You're like, wait, where did he get this hat? How do they know that? So I'm going to read you this little quote from the book that Ron and I were discussing today. It says, his house is generally thought to have been situated near the site of Aulnay's fort. It was a long, narrow, irregular building constructed partly of wood and partly of stone. The fort surrounding it contained 12 guns, a well, a chapel with a bell, several outbuildings, and a garden containing quite a number of fruit trees was attached to it. So this is from Wheeler's History of Castine, Penobscot, and Brooksville, something like that. So here's a record that purports from other sources that there was an orchard here is basically 1670, 1680, which, by the way, would have been north of Brunswick, one of the earliest, north of Brunswick, Maine, earliest orchards, documented orchards in Maine. And this is 1734. It shows the map with the Indian forts at Walker Pond, and then the settlers further south. And then here at the Wilson Museum, fast forward in 1826, in the collection here is a small list of apples that were grown in 1826 here on the property of Dr. Joseph Love Stevens, and his list of his apple trees. These are exceedingly rare. And Kate Uncle, who is a local gardener and friend, helped me identify these. And it basically lists the apples that were grown here in 1826. So as you begin to build up this story, you see that there's agriculture, there's settlers, there are apples. And it says this orchard was, according to tradition, the same Wheeler source, this orchard was, according to traditions of the place, situated on the upper side of the present street and opposite the fort. There's now no trace of it, but some octogenarians well remember seeing it in their younger days. According to a pretty trustworthy account, some of the young trees from this orchard were transplanted to Sedgwick, and apples gathered from them as late as 1763. They are in the farm of Levi Gray. So this is Gray's Corner. So when we're coming from Ellsworth down towards, say, Sargentville or Deer Isle, you come to Gray's Corner. This is going to take you down to Brooksville and Deer Isle. This is called Gray's Corner, and Levi Gray lived right along this section of the road in 1763, and if we believe this source, was harvesting French apples in Sedgwick in 1763. And here he is in the census records with his small farm and his son, him and his son. So this is the kind of stuff we do, is we piece together, okay, where is this? And now I've obviously already looked at Google Earth. Are there any farms left there? Could there be any trees left? Not much at Gray's Corner these days. So this means that their French apples were still present here in Castine, 1790, 1800. They were valued enough to be transplanted by the English settlers. And surviving trees that we might find are exceedingly old. So those are sort of the criteria. This is another tree from Fernald Point, very close to where the French attempted to settle in 1613. This is also about 11.5 feet in circumference. So as you go through, you begin to sort of piece together, well, where could these apples be? This is a map from 1881 of Castine, and you'll see the orchard here. There's an orchard here. There's also one across Hatches Cove or Wadsworth Cove. You know, looking at bird's eye views, would they have recorded orchards here? No. And then some recent DNA testing. We've been in contact with people locally doing some testing of some trees, some old trees, and gorgeous old trees over there in the old Gay farm. And it turned out to be a very famous sweet apple called Tolman Sweet. 2 of them, beautiful old trees, probably 100, 120 years old. And then in 2023, we had been doing testing. We've now done almost 700 DNA tests around Maine. And our friend Cameron Peace wrote us back, you know, email. You know, I told you, oh, you found this, you found this. And then under one from Verona Island says, wow, you found unknown founder 13. And so this is a French apple, one of the original, the trapdoor to Bretagne, one of the original ancestors, growing on a farm in Verona Island. What, 4.5 miles from Castine. And it's a great example of learning to unlearn bad habits. I have been to visit this place several times, and this is the scrawniest, most unremarkable tree you have ever seen. In the orchard, there are these gorgeous, like 9 foot in circumference, just huge, massive trees. And you know, when I walk into the orchard, I'm like, oh, big tree. But over in a rock pile on the north side of the house was this little scrawny tree with probably the rarest apple, we believe, probably one of the rarest apples in North America. Part of about 28 trees at this farm. Again, spectacular eating apple. When you have it, you're like, whoa, I see why this was one of the original ancestors of both French and English and American apples. So, is it a smoking gun? Have you found Castine's apples? Not yet, no. There appear to be 2 possibilities that we're trying to unravel. Drap d'Or is a spectacular apple, and it is grown. It's in the nursery trade in the United States throughout most of the 18th and 19th century. So somebody might have said, I want that apple, and planted it at their farm. So there is a chance that this apple was actually just a grafted tree that somebody chose a very, very rare French apple to grow at their place in Verona Island. Or it could have been continuously propagated through grafting along the Penobscot River Basin, like this tree was taken to Levi Gray's place over in Sedgwick. Somebody said, this is a great apple, I'm going to graft it. And this is the kind of thing you try to say, well, could the apple in Verona have come from the Sedgwick apple trees? Who knows? So we're launching a project called the Penobscot River Basin Apple Project, basically to start from about Bucksport down to Stonington and just survey as many apples as we can, because if we find 2, we have to add Sedgwick now, of course, because of this new. Huh? Excellent. Okay. So to see if we can find more of these French apples, because if we find more of them, it's less kind of likely that it's a one-off. But even if we did find them, it may not be the case that we could say, aha, we found them. If we found 5 of them together in an orchard, I'd be like, okay, well, you know, who knows? But so we're starting a project to map targeted testing from Bucksport down to Stonington. The red dots on this map are historic orchards that appear on U.S. coastal surveys from 1881 sort of shows distribution of some of the orchards. It's one of the places we're starting. We're going to focus on this area from the west shore of the Penobscot, basically down to Stonington to see what we might find. A few places like Naskeag that we may also sample. And we also need to do traditional research to see what we can find out about specific sites. Because, for example, there's this report of a French fishing station here. And I've had somebody share the story that this is at the bottom of Verona. No archaeologists have done any work on this. And so it's like, where was this? Where was this? And the chances that a tree would have survived that long are extremely rare, but are extremely unlikely, but worth at least pursuing. So if you're interested in getting involved, help us find old trees. And I always say, you know, if you have a tree in your backyard that's 11.5 feet in circumference, we'll come tomorrow. Or Klaus or Ron or someone else will come tomorrow. You can actually, through myfruittree.org, you can test your own trees so that you can see if you have trees in your backyard that are older trees, you can have them tested through myfruittree.org. And we can have a sign-up sheet if you're interested in that. And also you can just help support this work in whatever way, financially or morally. We prefer financially, but moral support is also, but also telling your friends, like, hey, I heard this really cool talk, and I remember you have a really crazy old tree. So that's what we're really looking for. And one of the things we were just joking about before this is these trees could be anywhere, right? Because we know the Castine trees got moved to Sedgwick, right? So it's not, so the design is the Penobscot River Valley based, blah, blah, blah. But we're looking for old trees because the idea is that we might find them. So, and then I just want to say thank you. I'm going to introduce a few people. Klaus, would you stand up with your team? Ron, Mark. So these are the Ancestor Apple Explorers. These are the folks who are going to be helping look up and down this area. They are from this area, which is delightful because when they say, hey, have you been to Morse Cove? I'm like, I have no idea. Wadsworth, I don't know. So they'll be helping particularly with looking around this area for the apple trees. So if afterwards you'd like to talk to one of them, we have a sign-up sheet if you're interested as well. And that way you can sort of, help us find these old trees. And one of the things that I wanted to say, remember that the trapdoor that we found in Verona is a scrawny ass little tree. So it doesn't have to be like the big tree. It has to just be a tree that is likely to have been an old tree. So thank you very much.